to make sure that that's happening. So I'm going to hand over now to Jason Pearl. Jason is Associate Professor of English at Florida International University, and he has very kindly agreed to introduce our speaker tonight, and that's Aaron Hanlon from Colby College. So Jason, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca, for making this seminar possible. Can you hear me? I assume you can.
We can. That's all good. I should also say to people that if you want to see a big picture of Jason, then you can click on his image, and it makes him big and the slides small. Okay, so if you can see where Jason is and you click on him, it'll make him big. Sorry, Tim.
Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Aaron Hanlon, who's an assistant professor of English at Colby College, and author of A World of Disorderly Notions, Quixote and the Logic of Exceptionalism, published in 2019 by the University of Virginia Press. Aaron is also at work on 2 new monographs, Understanding Science Denial, under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press, and the forthcoming Social and Empirical Knowledge in the 18th-Century Novel, under contract with Cambridge University Press, from which today's paper is derived. Aaron's first book studies the logic of personal exceptionalism employed by quixotic characters in British and American novels in the 18th and early 19th centuries. How do they see the world? How are their perspectives justified? As Aaron explains, the divergence from rules and norms is based on the characters themselves and their own self-images, rather than simply nostalgia or idealism. The new book, as well as today's paper, focuses on realism and argues that the novel contributed more successfully than we have acknowledged to our understanding of the production and transmission of knowledge. Setting aside the genre's innovations in form, Aaron looks at the category of the author and treats the novel as a system of social knowing. It would be easy to praise the quantity of his work, which has appeared in New Literary History, English Literary History, Modern Philology, the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation, and so on. I prefer to praise the quantity of this work, in particular, its intelligence and lucidity. I've always been impressed by the clarity of thought in Aaron's scholarship, but also the sophistication of ideas in his public writing. The ideal in both cases is tangible communication, the movement of concrete ideas from one person to another with no special dispensation, no logic of exceptionalism, you might say, for the author. He's enriched our understanding of the legacy of Cervantes, just as I expect he'll enrich our understanding of the philosophical contributions of Burney and Austen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? I guess I'm not going to know. All right. Good. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So first of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to Jason for the generous introduction, and to Rebecca for organizing and for inviting me to do this. It's really a pleasure and very exciting for me. I should also say, of Jason, I met him in the summer of 2016 when we were both on short-term fellowships at the Huntington Library, and he's really, I would say, the truth is that I am very shy, and he is really the first person who made me feel like I was part of a scholarly community, and not only in a field in such a setting as a library fellowship and conferences. And so I'm tremendously grateful to him for his generosity and kindness and friendship and guidance over the years, as well as for introducing me tonight. So that said, I'm going to mainly talk through a series of slides today, depending on where you are. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. For some of you, at very strange hours for such a thing. I'm going to talk through some slides rather than deliver prepared or written remarks, simply because I'm anticipating a fairly broad range of interests in the audience, from specialists in 18th century fiction and 18th century studies to people working in philosophy or coming to us from other backgrounds and areas of interest. I'm broadcasting to you from Colby College, which sits on Mayflower Hill, which sits on the ancestral territory of the Abenaki people, something to keep in mind as I talk about the virtues of social epistemology throughout the talk today. Now, the slides I have, which I'm going to share now, and hope that they have appeared largely for you relative to the screen that's showing my face. The slides that I have start with a bit of a roadmap here. And you will notice, despite the fact that I actually can count to 5, that these are not in numerical order. That's because the labels on the slides correspond to the headings on the access copy that I've made available, and I want people to be able to follow along according to those headings if they're using the access copy. But I've decided to move Burney to the front so that I can bookend the philosophy material in the middle of the talk between Burney and a little bit about sense and sensibility toward the end. So this is the plan. I'd like to start with the preface to Evelina, largely because it offers what I think is a very useful and profound image or snapshot of Burney's theory of the novel. And an important part of this is that, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of lag here. An important part of this is that for Burney, there we go. The novel is, and this is not unconventional by any means in the period, it presents itself in some ways as a social problem, but also as a pro-social form of didacticism, something that actually could benefit people if it's done right, although it could cause harm if it's not done the right way. The question then is, what is the right way for Burney? And she draws a distinction between novelistic representations drawn from nature, though not from life. And that's something to keep in mind, and that I want to draw out a little bit in the next couple of slides, particularly in regard to what I'm calling Burney's probabilistic and imaginative theory of the novel, which we might contrast with something of Henry Fielding or Daniel Defoe's kind of more empirical or reportage theories of the novel, if I could call it that. One of the most striking statements in any kind of 18th century theorizing of the novel for me is this moment in the preface to Evelina when Burney writes, referring to Richardson and Henry Fielding and Smollett and so on, that they may have cleared the weeds to some extent of fantastical or misleading or romantic fictions. They may have cleared the weeds, but they've also culled the flowers. And though they have rendered the path plain, they have left it barren. And I want to think about what this is getting at. And I don't claim to have, a thorough handle on it, but I think an important piece of it is in what I'm calling this kind of probabilistic and imaginative understanding of what novels can do at their best. So for one thing, Burney wrote about this notion of novel and probability a couple of other times, at least this is what I've come across early in the journals, for example, referencing Elizabeth Rowe's Friendship and Death as being so romantic that every word betrays improbability. Instead of disguising fiction, and displays the author instead of human nature. The other place where we see this is in The Wanderer, Burney's last novel, where she writes, it should convey useful precepts, a novel should convey useful precepts, and paint a picture of supposed but natural and probable human existence, with the goal of offering lessons of experience without the tears. So this notion of probable representation drawn from nature, imagined as something above and beyond a report of the world as such, is, I think, really important for Burney, and I think it's important in terms of how she envisioned the representation as having the capacity, and also in some Johnsonian fashion as well, I think you could say, is having the capacity to imagine a better world that might move us toward better precepts or better conduct or a better way of being. So I like to start with that because I think it gives some useful context for some moments in the novel in Evelina that I also want to uphold here as examples to think with, and that I invite you to think alongside, particularly in the context of what I'm about to get into in terms of social epistemology. And these examples are mainly to do with issues of credibility, decision-making in social scenarios, and drawing inferences in situations where we as readers, as well as the characters within the story, don't have the complete picture. So Evelina opens with Lady Howard's letter to Reverend Villers, in which Lady Howard expresses or reports this, what she calls disagreeable intelligence that Madame Duval has effectively become aware of Evelina's existence and might seek to bring Evelina into her family with consequences that are perhaps not good for Evelina. And so Lady Howard and Reverend Villers, we see from the beginning, are figures who, have some shared interest in the well-being of Evelina. And that's important background for a moment a bit later on when Lady Howard again writes to Villers, this time about the prospect of a lawsuit that Madame Duval is perhaps arranging to try and expose the parentage of Evelina for the purposes of, again, getting Evelina back into that family. In that letter, that other letter, second letter from Lady Howard to Villers, we get an assessment of Evelina's character, praise for her, the way that she's been brought up in her education, and a fairly straightforward comment about the power of credibility in terms of how trustworthy people might take knowledge in situations, or information in situations in which they don't have all of the facts at their disposal. Alongside this development by which the letters in the epistolary novel can kind of norm or check or test or triangulate different perspectives or different impressions about what's going on, and so different judgments about credibility and character. We also have just the way that Evelina focuses on matters of Evelina's credibility and how there are so many threats to it. And so the question looming always is how many of these threats are a function of her own character flaws, and how many of them are a function of these other men meddling in her life in ways that can have potentially negative impact on her and her reputation. So of course there's Madame Duval's just mortifying move when she orders Lord Orville's coach in Evelina's name, with the justification that the lady who wants the coach is the young lady he danced with once, as if that's sufficient basis for that type of request. And this, of course, mortifies Evelina after the fact, because she's concerned with what Orville will think of her. Sir Clement Willoughby is also, I would say, meddling and conniving in many ways, as when he just sort of shoves Evelina into the coach and absconds with her against her will. And again, when she gets out, when she's let out, there's Orville, and she's mortified again to be seen in the company of Sir Clement. This is all part of all of this, of course, web of confusion caused by Sir Clement's meddling. And it's exemplified perhaps most powerfully or most consequentially in the novel by Sir Clement's fraudulent letter written in Orville's name, which forces Evelina to question her own judgment on that second reading, to recognize that this is actually more forward than I would expect of Orville, and yet in his name, and puts both Evelina and Orville in a situation thereafter where they have to be very circumspect about the judgments that they will make about one another in deciding how to proceed given this letter, which of course turns out to be, written by Sir Clement. And just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say how these various letters in Evelina contribute to notions of credibility, this is that second letter I spoke of from Lady Howard to Villers, in which, in the second arrow at the bottom there, she acknowledges, I don't actually, and I'm of course paraphrasing this first part, I don't actually know what your reasons are for withholding information about Evelina's parentage and so on, but I respect those reasons. Without knowing, I respect them from the high opinion I have of your character and judgment. So it's just a little indication, but a clear one, that we're dealing with a credibility economy in this novel, and indeed in many others. So I'm going to step back a little bit now from Evelina and talk now a bit about what I've been calling social epistemology. And a starting point for that is just recognizing that what I'm doing in this talk and with this broader project is taking a cognitive approach to fiction and to literature more broadly. Cognitivism, literary cognitivism, is simply the belief or the view that literary works may actually afford some significant knowledge, and therefore it might be fruitful to investigate that possibility, or to pay attention to how novels contribute to how and what we know. Anti-cognitivism has a couple of flavors according to Meikonen, and I find his schema here really useful. There is the outright rejection of the possibility that you can have knowledge from literature. And in the Q&A, we don't need to get into it right now, but in the Q&A, if you like, we can talk about some of the reasons why people might make that argument. But more common, I think, is the moderate version of literary anti-cognitivism, which recognizes that you could, yes, have knowledge in fiction, but really that's not the point of fiction, and it's not the point of studying fiction, or it's not the point of studying literature more broadly. And so it's not really worth investigating. We should be paying attention to matters of form or aesthetics or cultural history or have you. And so I'm taking a cognitivist approach here. And this, I think, is useful for philosophy. And by the end of the talk, I hope the reason why will be clear, but I'll sort of temporarily withhold it. But it's also useful, I think, for the study of the novel, insofar as a lot of consideration about novelistic realism, particularly in the 18th century or in novels of the 18th century, has been either kind of a furthering of or a repudiation of Ian Watt's concept of the novel's formal realism. So that's to say that even when people don't agree or don't find convincing that basic thesis about the novel's formal realism, the rejection of that thesis is in terms of form. And Peter Boxall has a great example of this in The Value of the Novel, in which he is discussing J.M. Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello, in which Elizabeth Costello is giving a lecture about Kafka's short story, A Report for an Academy, a story of an ape called Red Peter, who is himself addressing a group of academics and explaining how he, the ape, came to acquire human knowledge and language and behavior and intelligence and so on. And the point that Boxall makes via Coetzee, via Elizabeth Costello, via Kafka, via Red Peter is that from a formal standpoint, there isn't anything in that story or in Red Peter's address that distinguishes that as truthful or that allows us some special purchase on what is true. We need to come at that from a different angle, or we need to know more than the form of the address, of course, to understand the difference between a story about an ape giving an address to a bunch of academics and you know, an actual phenomenon like that. So I think by thinking about more about social epistemology and taking a break from the debates about novelistic realism, particularly if we're conceiving of realism as a formal feature of the novel, we might have something generative here. At least that's the case that I'd like to make. So further to that, form becomes limiting in the sense that a lot of the features listed in the first bullet point on the slide there of that we often attribute to 18th century novels as markers or signals of formal realism also belong to other kinds of writing. Jenny Davidson writes really convincingly about the role of the minute particular in 18th century life writing, for example. So the formal features of novelistic realism aren't constitutive, or they don't help differentiate in ways that we might want to if we're thinking about epistemological questions and knowledge in the novel. I would say that novels such as Evelina and Sense and Sensibility actually have, you know, over and above form, have a thematic focus on things like decision making, particularly in social situations with incomplete information, inference and lecture, credibility of ideas as well as credibility of speakers, and the quality and provenance of evidence or the absence of evidence. And so, again, not something that's entirely new. You can think of articles, you know, by J. Paul Hunter and John Bender, for example, that have touched on epistemology of the novel. What's missing from that line of thinking often, or what's underemphasized, is the social epistemology component. What I mean by the social epistemology component is the movement toward an understanding of the production of knowledge as a social enterprise and away from the idea that we know by honing the methods and practices of the individual knower. So it's not enough to simply situate individuals within their particular epistemic or experiential context. We also need to know how, more broadly, how group dynamics actually impact what types of access we have to what types of knowledge and how those get synthesized or not in the bigger picture of what we say we know. The reason Evelina and Sense and Sensibility, I think in particular, are useful cases for thinking about this kind of thing. Social epistemology, there are several. This list is by no means exhaustive, but I hope it's suggestive. There's the relatively mundane and widely understood notion of what I would call the moral panic about what women, 18th century women read and how they read. There is, which of course puts pressure on social decision making and representations in novels, fear of misleading about moral or otherwise conditions of the world. There's the fact that, and we've seen a lot of really great work on this recently. I like to particularly Tita Chico's The Experimental Imagination is great on this point, that the gender exclusivity of the Royal Society is such that if you're looking at this from a social epistemology standpoint, there simply there are not sufficient people in the room to have sufficient viewpoints on reality. Which is to say, if you have just men and mostly of a particular background, then there are many things that by virtue of them being who they are, and by virtue of others being who they are, that are not accounted for in that room, so to speak. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, a bit more detail about that in a moment. But I want to point out that a lot of wonderful work on the ways that Royal Society writing tends to use figurative and language and imaginative concepts in the production of matters of fact and in the production of notions of objectivity is a step most certainly in the right direction. But it's also, I just think, about a simpler question about who's counted as an epistemologist, right? Who's counted as being interested in how we know what we know. I'll say briefly about what I see as, and what many of you out there are certainly know probably better than I do, about the disproportionate stakes of social knowing, particularly for women in the period that we're looking at here. One really concrete example is just the fact of the difficulty of obtaining divorces or annulments in abusive marriages. Something like maybe 300, a little over 300 sanctioned divorces granted between 1650 and 1850, roughly in England. And I think, if I'm getting my figures correct from the Roderick Phillips book, maybe 4 of them granted to women. So the possibility that one had further options obviously put a lot of pressure on, or the lack of possibility of having further exit strategies, let's say, put a lot of pressure on, at the point of decision making about partnerships. So I should also say then that I've been, questioning the value of a formal approach to the epistemology of the novel, but that's not to say it should be discounted. Certainly the epistolary form does something powerful in its ability to, as I've suggested with Burney examples, to kind of triangulate different perspectives and help us see the process by which we and other characters are making judgments of credibility. This bit about credibility has long since exploded the possibilities for the history and philosophy of science. So, depending on who you are out there and what your field is, I might be saying something that's really, really boring, or I might be saying something that you haven't thought about. But this notion that's, I think, Stephen Shapin captures really well in a paper from decades ago, Cordelia's Love, in which he uses Cordelia as an example of someone who reasons sort of like a Royal Society gentleman, believing that the truth, such as it is, will speak for itself, and it doesn't need rhetoric on top of it. It turns out, though, that for King Lear, credibility actually requires a demonstration, perhaps a rhetorical demonstration of that love that Cordelia believes should speak for itself and should be rather plain. And so Shapin takes us as an example to illustrate the important recognition that many of the claims of credibility or the workings of credibility in the production of scientific knowledge resemble those of credibility in ordinary life. And this throws open the doors of materials that become relevant and archives that become relevant for thinking about epistemology. And my premise here, I guess, is that people who are interested in the 18th century novel should consider walking through those doors. People already have, of course, but perhaps more should, because there's a lot here to work with. One more social epistemology concept I want to introduce here comes from the feminist philosopher Helen Longino, the concept of transformative interrogation. And it works in the way that I've explained in terms of the function of Burney's epistolary form as an example. That's to say, for Longino, transformative interrogation is a complex process of criticism, modification, and incorporation among people with different perspectives, different conjectures, different viewpoints on what they are examining and what they're seeing. And it's reconciling those differences in the pursuit of knowledge within a community, an epistemic community. So it's really important to think about this, I think, with Evelina, because it is, and with epistolary novels in general, I think quite often, because such novels actually can model in really interesting ways the way this type of situation can work. And it's a point that you made among, or amid the, niche culture wars happening now about epistemology. But I mean, this is fairly classic standpoint epistemology stuff. I'm showing you now a passage from Charles Mills, philosopher Charles Mills' landmark essay, White Ignorance. And it's often claimed that, at stake in broadening the diversity of perspectives in an epistemic community is a matter of morality and a matter of politics. It certainly is those things, but the claims of Longino and Mills, I think, that are often, not wholly appreciated, among the general public anytime this stuff comes up, is the claim is actually that it's also empirically insufficient. That's to say, if we presuppose a white rational observer whose movement in the world does not allow that person to access many experiences in the world, we therefore are missing a huge part of the world. The concept isn't super complex, but coming to this argument is in a way. And so Mill's concept of white ignorance as not just as a moral or political virtue, but as an epistemic virtue, actually kind of complements Longino. So mindful of the time, I'm going to run through two quick examples from Sense and Sensibility, and then we can talk a bit more, I hope. The way I want to frame this is, if the bigger picture of how we sort out differences of perspective and judgment in a knowledge community happens or is well modeled by a novel setup like Evelina, where credibility is really at the heart of things, and social judgment is at the heart of things, and triangulating different characters' perspectives helps us get a better grasp on what's going on and what judgments are sound versus unsound, a better, though not certainly perfect, grasp. Austen's Sense and Sensibility focuses minutely on the inference. And I'm not going to present something to you that's any kind of profound new reading of Sense and Sensibility. I simply want to show the examples here of things that I think are relevant to the broader argument about the novel and social epistemology. And I want to point out in so doing that the very thing that I think that Cliff Siskin has identified as the proliferation of systems, the genre of system in the historical Enlightenment in Britain is something that's bound together by inferences that require an imaginative leap. And so this is part of a much broader concatenated set of approaches to knowing, and a much broader set of different types of systems, or sort of basically putting things in relation and justifying the relations that you've put them in by a set of principles. It's part of a broader constellation of systems, among which I would count the novel, as ways of mediating between, in Siskin's words, of mediating between the physical world and our efforts to know it, or I would add to that, the social world and our efforts to know it. And Adam Smith actually says it pretty well. All philosophical systems are mere inventions of the imagination to connect together the otherwise just disjointed and discordant phenomena of nature. That inventions of the imagination piece, I think, aligns very nicely with Burney's theory of the novel, the idea that you represent the probable, but it involves something, an imaginative leap, an imaginative excess over and above the mere report of things as they are. And so when you get a comparison of inference making and Sense and Sensibility, I'm going to read this passage because I want people to just dwell for a moment on the aggregation of epistemological language and words in this little passage. And this is from that moment. It's a kind of a heartrending moment, actually, when Eleanor, who is certainly interested in Edward, realizes and hears from Lucy that he's actually been engaged to her. And she doesn't want to believe it at first, of course, but she has no other choice when she reasons the way she does. So, however small Eleanor's general dependence on Lucy's veracity might be, it was impossible for her on serious reflection to suspect it in the present case, where no temptation could be answerable to the folly of inventing a falsehood of such a description. What Lucy had asserted to be true, therefore, Eleanor could not, dared not longer doubt, supported as it was, too, on every side by such probabilities and proofs, and contradicted by nothing but her own wishes. The immediate knowledge of the Miss Steeles as to the Norland and the family connections, which had often surprised her, the picture, the letter, the ring, formed altogether such a body of evidence as overcame any fear of condemning him unfairly. So, and established as a matter of fact, which no particularity could set aside. So here it is crucially, you could just take the Royal Society motto, nullius in verba, and just slap it on the method of reasoning here. Eleanor doesn't want to take Lucy's word for it and has some reason to be suspicious, but cannot think otherwise, that what Lucy has said is the truth when she has the material evidence, the letter in Edward's hand, the picture in Lucy's possession, the ring, and so on. That's contrasted with Marianne's way of reasoning. And I'm very deliberate in my language there because, I mean, the one usage of the word system in Sense and Sensibility comes to describe Marianne. I think it's a little bit ironic, of course, but it's also telling. Eleanor suggests that Marianne's systems have all the unfortunate tendency of setting propriety at naught. And at one point, when Marianne has been gallivanting around with Willoughby and he's showing her the house that he believes he will inherit as if it will be their home together and so on, and this is making Eleanor uneasy, and she approaches Marianne, and of course I'm paraphrasing, and says, "This might give you pleasure, you might enjoy this, but it's not prudent." And Marianne replies, if there had been any real impropriety in what I did, I should have been sensible of it at the time, for we always know when we are acting wrong. And with such a conviction, I could have had no pleasure. If the impertinent remarks of Mrs. Jennings are to be the proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offending every moment of all our lives. I value not her censure any more than I should do her commendation. And so this system of setting propriety at naught gets Marianne undoubtedly into some trouble. She is hurt by, misled by Willoughby. On the other hand, the feelings we later learn, his feelings, are true, which is to say she has read the situation in some ways correctly. But it's her rejection of Mrs. Jennings' comments, because Mrs. Jennings is not somebody who she invests credibility in, because Mrs. Jennings is often talking about the affairs of other people, that is the basis of Marianne's reason that she shouldn't bother with this type of gossip. And I think there's something actually good in that. there's a rationale there that's worth rescuing, and it is worth thinking about in some sense as a system, which is skeptical of propriety when propriety can be based on not fully fleshed out suppositions about credibility. So with that, I'll simply conclude, and with an interview from a recent interview from the historian of science, Simon Schaffer. This is simply to say the 18th century novel could be a really promising and interesting archive for people today thinking about social epistemology, and it would have the virtue epistemically, socially, politically, and so on of recognizing the contributions of women who wrote fiction, often about women, to the bedrock of how we think we know things from the 18th century onward. And I like this bit from Schaffer because he's talking about the sociology of science and the idea that sociologists of science are trying to get into the controversy and see science in action, because if they wait until the controversy is resolved, they will have missed all the particulars about how it got resolved. Whereas the historian has to look back and try to reconstruct those particulars of a scientific controversy. So if you're looking for an archive, in addition to the various ways that historians of science try to reconstruct these controversies, if you're looking for an archive that bears on social epistemology, I think it would be fruitful to look at the 18th century novel. Thank you very much for your time. I'll stop there and then welcome your questions.
Aaron, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. One of the great disadvantages of this virtual medium is that we can't give you a proper round of applause. So I will give you a round of applause just on my own, and other people may want to put virtual applause into the chat as we go along. Thank you so much. That was such a rich talk and so fascinating for people interested in literature and for philosophers and people working in all sorts of disciplinary areas. We're going to have a Q&A in a moment. And I should perhaps just say that at the start of this academic year, there may well be lots of people who are new to research, who are perhaps beginning out on their PhD journeys. This is the kind of talk actually where we may have people who are not in academic research at all. And so when we invite people for the Q&A, please don't feel as though you already ought to have lots of knowledge to be able to ask lots of questions. This is a genuine Q&A and an opportunity to ask real questions. What I'm going to do, in fact, perhaps I can suggest that we stop sharing the screen so that when this goes onto the video, people will see your face and the questioner's face is large. That might be helpful. I don't know whether you can figure out how to. I think if I can click the stop sharing. There we are. Okay. That's great. Yeah. Okay, there we are. That's good. So at this point, then, let me invite participants to ask questions. Now, the way that we can do this most straightforwardly in this interface, Blackboard, is if you glance to the bottom of your screens, you will see a row of little buttons. You'll see your microphone button, you'll see a video button, and you'll also see a little person with their hand raised. And if you'd like to ask a question, then that's the easiest way to do it. So you just click on, I'm doing it now to show you. you click on raise hand, and then you can lower your hand. And if people would like to ask questions, then I'll invite you either to unmute yourself and perhaps put your video on if you want to, or to type the question into the chat button if you would like to do that. So let me see, do we have any hands up? Perhaps while we're waiting, it takes a while for people to kind of gather their thoughts. So I wonder whether I've got a couple of people asking questions. Well, in fact, I'll go to the questioners then, and then I can come back with my question if we've got time afterwards. Miriam, I can see you've gone to the top of the list. I don't know your surname. That's not a problem at all. But you may like just to either to unmute yourself or type the question. I can see you've unmuted yourself, Miriam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes, just to say, this is an extremely relevant argument at the moment because in the UK, decision has been made to cut novels completely from the exam system. So I don't know if this is an unusual one compared to other countries or the US. I'm hoping it will be reversed. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that, but that's certainly distressing to me because, I mean, I've given a kind of quick cognitive account of novel in terms of social epistemology, but I mean, I'm thinking about all the things that novels do and all the reasons to study them that would make it a really bad idea to stop doing that. So I think I'm thinking also of Joshua Landy's book, Doing Things with Fictions, which is a great catalog of like sort of the opposite of my argument of all the things that you can do with novels that would make them very much worth our time. So yeah, what should send me the petition to sign? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Miriam, thank you very much for your question. Andrew McKendry, do you want to put yourself off mute and put your video on if you want to, and ask away?
Can you see me? Can you see me? And you can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Wow. Okay. So yes, thanks for the talk. It was fascinating, and I thought your framing of it, and you didn't go towards this, but it resonates so much, obviously, with current debates. And I'm sure you could have brought that out and about climate, so I'm sure you're thinking that, and I thought that was really interesting. But my question's not about current debate, it's about religion. And I'm sorry if this is off base because it was about science and there was no religion in the talk. But it seemed when you were talking about systems of knowing, I was thinking about that because you connected a lot of these debates with, controversies about credibility and probability and belief. And of course, at the time, a lot of those are going on surrounding issues like spirits and ghosts and scripture and the Trinity and stuff like that. And I was thinking, of course, when you read about those, the thing that always strikes you is that, the stories of Jonas and Jesus are, outwardly quite improbable. But of course, they're super, they have tons of credibility at the time. So I guess the kind of practical question then is about Evelina and about the novel is in Evelina, for instance, where do dynamics like providence or even more interesting, I think, predetermination or predestination, how do those fit in? Are those just kind of cast aside, which would give us a kind of standard trajectory of secularization? Or are they like folded in or something? Because those seem like a highly improbable, a system that's highly improbable from one perspective, but really is in conflict with, I think, the ways we think about credibility and probability and stuff. So where do those fit in?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. For Evelina, I'm not terribly sure how it fits, but certainly I think probably I'm unoriginal in going here, but for Robinson Crusoe, for example, and for all the effort that Defoe makes in that novel to represent things formally in realistic and credible ways, details about process and configurations, spatial configurations and charts and so on, ledgers or whatever. The moment of Friday's conversion and coming to trust in providence to some extent is the least convincing thing in the whole book, which is to say, the question that you're asking is really interesting because for me in particular, because it shows how the formal features of credibility are not enough to indicate actual credibility. And I think you can see formal commonalities between the organization of 17th century sermons and 17th century scientific atlases in terms of enumerating reasons and references and so on. So that's one direction I would go with that, is that the places where form breaks down as a convincing signal get us into some of these other thematic questions about where credibility is being invested. I'm sorry, I got a little rambly at the end.
No. That makes a lot of sense to me. That seems like a great answer, especially just that's great. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Richard Somerset, would you like to unmute yourself and share your video if you want to? Richard, have we got you there? If you're having trouble unmuting, then you're very welcome to type your question into the chat. Okay, if we can't hear from Richard straight away, let's move to Min Wild. Min, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yep, can you hear me?
We can hear you, we can, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, hello. I really enjoyed that. It was fascinating. Thank you very much, Aaron. And it fitted very nicely with some things I've been thinking about Evelina for quite a long time. Particularly teaching the moment when she gets that letter, which is purportedly from Orville, and she does have what is seems to be a full-blown epistemological crisis, doesn't she? Because she doesn't know whether she's on her head or her heels, because everything she thought she knew about the world just isn't there anymore. It's just gone wrong in terrible ways. So I like that. And so to test what you've been talking about, I'm going to ask you if you can confirm this, if I've got this right. Because in Robinson Crusoe, he does, you mentioned that. In Robinson Crusoe, we go along with Robinson's reasonings about whether he should or should not kill the cannibal. And, there's that great long section where he's putting all the pros and cons, and he's considering how to act, what to do. And I wonder whether one way and I realize that your theory works beautifully with these two women novelists in particular, because perhaps we could say, is this right, that women are really struggling how to know at this period? How do we know? How can we find things out? But men are much more concerned about how they should act. See what I mean? There's that dichotomy. So men are expected to act, and women are expected not to act in the same spheres and in the same ways. But women are denied knowledge in the way that men aren't. And so their epistemological approaches, their epistemological crises are about what to trust, what to know, credibility, as you were saying. Whereas for men, it's much more about what should I do. It's much more straightforward. Is that am I in the right kind of area with all that rambling?
I think that beautifully fleshes out exactly the what I left unsaid about what I was gesturing toward as the disproportionate stakes of social knowing. That's to say, I would add, so I think that's right what you say, and I think on top of it, it's a matter of also there being already a framework of an acceptable epistemological vocabulary, which has all of its, I shall refer the reader to the figure. And when Austen brings in some of that language in Sense and Sensibility, I think it does a very powerful thing. But in Evelina, I think it's right to say, and I was I'm a bad multitasker, but I was reading also somebody's question in the chat or comment in the chat about youthful characters sort of being, subject to these situations that you're describing, and whether this is a potential mode of powerful feminine epistemology. And I think actually having the language that doesn't simply reproduce the language of Royal Society natural philosophy is part of that. And I think it's also part of what you're getting at, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Fascinating.
Thank you, Mim. Thank you very much. James Wood, would you like to unmute yourself and put your video on if you want to? Thank you.
Yeah, hi Aaron. Nice to see you. And nice to see Jason. Well, we all hung out with each other in Edinburgh last year. So I was wondering, because I'm sure that you've looked at Stephanie Hirschnow's book, which seems to me, on the face of it, kind of at odds with your project. I mean, if I'm sort of paraphrasing her idea correctly, it's that the protagonists of novels, by Burney, they kind of they don't change, or they don't learn, or they don't develop, all these things. Sorry. I just said I continue if that's sorry.
I was just going to say, if everyone else can just make sure that your microphones are off, that would be helpful. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, no, sorry, I thought I was doing something wrong. Thank you. Okay, so, but that sort of eternal status as a novice, as someone who doesn't know, sort of opens up kind of an utopian possibility within the novel, and I suppose that's linked, with Jason Pearl's work on sort of these sort of embedded within realist narrative. So I guess I was just wanting to know about your thoughts about that, about the ways that the novels might be opening up possibilities, not of knowledge, but of sort of not knowing, or of ignorance. I mean, I think the striking example that Stephanie Hirschnow uses is is this way that for women there's this need to think of a world where women are draped. I mean, that is her example, which is obviously not this world, but the condition of naivety sort of brings that possibility into being. So yeah, I'll just end there.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to answer this in a slightly, from a strange angle, in part because Stephanie's book is in my stack, but I haven't actually gotten to it yet. But if I understand correctly the question, there's a couple things. So one is that maybe this isn't fair, but I think it's actually useful in some contexts to think of naivete or ignorance as knowledge, when it's knowledge of not knowing. In other words, when it's epistemic humility. We can talk about the ethics of how epistemic humility is, how it's come by, or how it's imposed. That's a different question. But knowing when you don't know, it is, I think, actually a very valuable form of knowledge, and it's an important piece of, a lot of now kind of like the psychology of conspiracy theory and so on. That it's really interesting. But then I would also say that I wouldn't suggest that everybody should become some sort of literary cognitivist of the novel. In other words, I think it's possible that we can say novels can be, of this period, and particularly Burney and Austen, can be really useful documents for, in an archive of models of social epistemology, but also can do other things above and beyond what sorts of modeling or representation they have of knowing or knowledge as such. Are you still with me?
Thanks, Aaron. And thank you for the question. So we're over the hour, but we have perhaps time for one last question from Peter Howell. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely, good. Can I ask a really boring and sort of hackneyed question about free indirect discourse? I loved your talk, but you a novel that's epistolary, and then one that's third person with a kind of developing free indirect discourse. I'm not very familiar with the idea of the social epistemology and all that, but surely. I don't know, could you just say a few words about the development of third-person narrative, omniscient narration, and free and direct discourse, and how that might, I don't know, my inclination is to say that you know it inhibits the kind of the full expression of various different you know social epistemologies, but you know just in terms of you know Francis Burney developed free and direct discourse to some extent, and then you know we're told that Jane Austen you know developed it after Sense and Sensibility, and particularly in Emma. How does that interact with, you know, how does that impact on what you're saying?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because you're pointing to a really important omission in what I have said, which is that it's really something. It's a really important question. So, you know, so on one hand, we could say, and I would say that the way that, for example, an epistolary novel models social epistemology is one thing, and the way that Austen puts a lot of pressure on the reasoning behind social inferences is another formulation of, it's another thing, or it's another way to get at the question of social epistemology, even if it doesn't do as well at triangulating different judgments. But it's also a really pertinent question because of Austen having made the decision actually to kind of revise the epistolary form of Eleanor and Marianne into the third person narration of Sense and Sensibility. And what we still are left with, I think, in Sense and Sensibility, though, is a similar epistemic problem, which is that you can have a preponderance of letters in an epistolary novel from one character that sort of makes it harder to get a wider picture of things, and you can have Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility kind of standing in for a certain narrative perspective. At least that argument has been made, and so I think even though the forms here are different, there are similar impacts of the centering the narrative perspective on one character, and then how do you read the novel such that you can understand or pull out the relationships between that character and the others, such that you can get a kind of bird's eye view of it. And I think you're right to say that there are some limiting factors there, right? That there are things that you just can't pull out of, you know, of certain narrative forms. But
right, yeah. Could I just ask about Cecilia? So you know, obviously Evelina is the only epistolary novel that Francis Burney wrote. So Cecilia doesn't know till very, very near the end Mr. Monckton is up to no good, and how could she? There's no. I mean, I don't know. Could you say a few words about that in terms of, you know, your arguments about social epistemology?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly I just have not attended to Cecilia in 10 years, and I don't think I could say anything useful, to be completely honest.
Okay. No, it's cool. But I mean, I think it's really, that would be really interesting to see how, you know, her ignorance, but it's you know, she cannot be blamed for it. She could never know who's working against her. You know, I think that'd be interesting in terms of your argument.
So yeah, I'm gonna then look into that. That's very helpful.
Cool.
This is exactly the sort of that a seminar ought to end on, one that takes us off into new areas of research and thought and investigation. And there's a whole other conversation going on in the chat at the moment about future events, even as well as different kinds of ways of reading the work that you've done. So Aaron, thank you so much for a talk that has stimulated conversation and thought, and that will go on percolating, I think, in the minds of us all as we go into this new academic year. So again, I'm afraid I'm left as the real applause, but many people will be thanking you, and indeed are thanking you in the chat. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming, for your contributions, for your questions, for your contributions to the chat. The recording of this talk will be on YouTube, so if you want to go back through Aaron's arguments and think about them again and re-watch them, reread them, they'll be there for you. We meet again next month when Rebecca Barr is going to be speaking to us, and you can sign up for that talk on the ODSECS website now. We're also looking for people to give papers at ODSECS next year in 2021 in 3 of the slots for next year. We're interested in all sorts of papers, but we're especially interested in contributions from postdoctoral early career researchers and from researchers who are on insecure contracts or researchers who are employed outside teaching and research. So again, all the information is on the ODSECS website. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Aaron, very, very much. It's been a really wonderful session. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you, my pleasure.